Live. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give it a few minutes to let people into the room before we get started. Again, welcome, everybody. We'll be starting in a couple minutes. Just allow people to come into the room. Okay, it's a couple minutes after 9, so we're going to get started here. Welcome to our School Mental Health Summit, Emerging Stronger and More Resilient, Learning from the COVID-19 Crisis. This is day 2 of our virtual conference. The 2021 Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC School Mental Health Summit brings together leaders, practitioners, researchers, and other stakeholders in the school mental health field to share the latest research and best practices. Next slide, please. The conference emphasizes a shared family community agenda to bring high quality and evidence-based mental health promotion, prevention, and intervention to students and families as part of a multi-tiered system of supports. This conference is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is PJ Wenger, and I am the Senior Training and Consultation Specialist of this center. I will be hosting this conference session today along with our presenter. This is day 2, session 1, the secret sauce for building successful homeschool partnerships. Next slide. In the next 2 slides, you will see the listings and times for today's conference sessions. The full schedule and individual Zoom links can be found on our conference website. My colleague will put that website into the chat box so that you can see the remaining sessions that we have today. Next slide. So this is session 4, and again, the website for the entire conference website is listed there on the screen and will be put in the chat box. Next slide. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. We have also been awarded additional supplemental funding focused on enhancing student mental health in schools. Please visit the MHTTC network website for additional information. Again, that will be that link will be put in the chat box. Next slide, please. Funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaskan Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Our center is Region 2, serving New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. Supplemental funding was awarded to provide training and technical assistance to teacher and school staff regarding student mental health. The objectives of these activities is to communicate the importance of mental health supports in schools, enhance the capacity to recognize and identify mental health concerns in students, and to educate staff on the best models of school-based mental health services and when to link to community-based services. Next slide, please. We have the capacity and expertise to provide national webinars, general trainings, professional development meetings, and intensive technical assistance and consultation services on school mental health topics that are listed on this slide. Next slide. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen and will be shared in the chat box as well. Next slide, please. Following the webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. These surveys and that linkage allows us to provide these webinars and conferences to you free of charge. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide, please. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our conference website along with the PowerPoint slides within a week of the conclusion of this conference. Next slide, please. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Next slide, please. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A period of our presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. Please use the chat feature to answer those questions and interact with our presenter. Next slide, please. The MHTTC uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. This includes language that is strength-based and hopeful, language that is inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, language that is healing-centered and trauma-responsive, language that invites individuals to participate in their own recovery journey, language that is person-first and free of labels, language that is non-judgmental and avoids assumptions, language that is respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. Now let's begin our webinar. Normally, I would introduce our speaker, Sherry Wilson. However, normally I would read her biography. However, she has requested that she introduce herself and tell you all about herself. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, and she will tell you all about herself. Sherry?
Thank you, PJ. I am Sherry Wilson, and today I want to talk with all of you about strengthening homeschool partnerships. And just so you know, I have a lot of experience in this field. I was actually the director of the Alabama Parent Information and Resource Center for about 15 years. And in my time in Alabama, I traveled all over the state working with schools that had large concentrations of low-income and minority families, working with the families and with the schools to develop everybody's capacity to work in partnership with each other. That was a grant-funded position, and when the grant funding went away, I moved to DC and I worked at National PTA for about 4 years, managing all of their family engagement programs and activities. And then I got recruited away by Scholastic. And I started with Scholastic about 6 years ago. I was full-time staff for the first 2 years building out their family and community engagement team, and since then have become a consultant for them. And I continue to work with schools and districts around the country to help them build their capacity to work with families. I was also a founding board member for the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement. And about 4 years ago, I joined them as staff. And now I work as the Director of Engagement and State Partnerships. I had 2 kids who thankfully grew up and moved out and are supporting themselves, which is all I ever really wanted. And I have the most beautiful car in the world, which I think you can see on the screen. So I'm really, really excited to be here with you and tell you what I know about family and community engagement. And today I want to focus on 3 things. I want to examine why family engagement is an important instructional strategy. I want to discuss the importance of trusting, respectful relationships. And I want to explore the strategies that help build the capacity of families to support learning. So as we go through this, if you have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box, put your comments in the chat box. I would love to respond to any of those. If you have challenges that you already face related to working with families that we don't get a chance to cover today, you can pop those in the Q&A box too. And if we have time, I'll respond to those as well. So I want to start by thinking about why this matters, why family engagement is so important to the work that you do. One thing we know from the research is that children are awake for about 6,000 hours, but they're only in school for about 1,000 of those hours. And another thing we know is that children don't shut off their learning valve when they walk out of the school door. Everywhere they go, we have opportunities to support their learning and their development so that they are healthy and happy. And the only way we'll be really successful is if we all work together to ensure that every child has every opportunity to succeed. So this is really, really important work when you think about it that way. So let's start by focusing on the relationship building between families and school staff. One thing we know is that relationships are the foundation of the work that we do with families, and we won't be successful unless we have trusting, respectful relationships with them. We will also talk about incorporating family engagement as an instructional strategy after we get through this. But I really want to focus on the trust issue. Because one of the challenges we have in working with families is they often don't trust institutions. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. It could be that they struggled in school themselves and they don't think of school as a happy place. Or it could be that they have children who have issues. I had 2 children, as I mentioned earlier, but only because the first one tricked me into thinking they were quiet and well-behaved. So when I had the second one, I was in for a shock. My youngest son, who is the apple of my eye, he is the most entertaining and fun and happy person in the world. He is also a person who struggles with some issues of his own. He had learning disabilities, he had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, he had a lot of behavior challenges when he was in school. And so when he was going to school, often I was getting calls, sometimes every day, that Tyler wouldn't sit still, or he wouldn't stop talking, or he wouldn't stop beating his pencils on his desk. It was always something. And when the person you love the most in the world is being constantly called out for bad behaviors or other challenges, you start to believe that perhaps the school doesn't love your child as much as you do. Right or wrong, a lot of families have that perception because of the experiences they've had. So it's important to build trust with families, and sometimes that means rebuilding trust because their trust has been broken, and sometimes their trust was broken before you even meet them. So you really have to spend some time working on the relationship before you go any further. There are a couple of strategies that you can use to build those trusting, respectful relationships. One thing you can start with is focusing on the strengths of the child and the family and highlighting the positive things as much as possible. If you can find something to send home to a family about what their child is doing well, it is really powerful, especially if that's not something that they've heard often in the past. A lot of families say the only time they hear from schools is when their child is doing something wrong or there's a problem happening at school. So focusing on those positive things can really help you start to rebuild that trust. Um, Also, listening to them. So a lot of families feel like they don't have an opportunity to share their own concerns about their child or their child's education. So it's important to give them that platform and really allow them to express whatever their concerns are and respond to those concerns in a really, really respectful way. Um, Also, welcoming them actively is a really important strategy. A lot of families, particularly families who are at the secondary level in middle or high school, feel like they're not as welcome in their child's school. And even some elementary schools are not always as welcoming as they should be. One thing that you can do to start to assess how welcome you are to families is to do a walkthrough of your campus and start outside the front door. When you stand outside the front door, stand about 15 feet away and look at the front of your building and look and see what the first thing is that catches your eye. It should be a sign that says welcome in all of the languages that your family speak. If it's not, then you should think about adding that. Also, you should think about how you welcome families into the learning environment, because it's not enough just to welcome them into the building. They also have to be welcomed into the learning environment. There's a researcher named Kathy Hoover Dempsey who's retired now, but when she did her work, she was out of Vanderbilt and she had just a ton of research that she did. But one of the things she found was that families really need three things to be engaged. The first thing they need is a sense of invitation. Somebody has to say to them, you have a really important role to play in your child's learning and development, and we're here to support you with that. So that sense of invitation is critical. The other two things they need, just so you know, is they have to believe it's going to help their child. If they don't think it's going to help their child in particular, it feels like a waste of time to them. So making sure when you're communicating with families that it's relevant to their child is also really important. And the last thing they need is a sense of self-efficacy. So they feel confident that they can do whatever it is you're asking them to do to support their child's learning and development. So welcoming them in is a really important part of building these relationships with families. And then the last thing is demonstrating that you care. That is so important because, again, families have to believe that you care for their children. And sometimes, if the only thing they're ever hearing from the schools is negative or critical, they really start to doubt that. So it's really helpful if you can demonstrate you care in a lot of different ways. One thing you might want to think about doing is positive messages home. That really reinforces that you care about their child and that you're interested in working in partnership with them. So I'm going to pause now and ask you to write in the chat any of the strategies that you've used in the past to build relationships with families. Because I know a lot of us are already doing this kind of work, and I think it would be helpful if you have an opportunity to share with each other some of the things that you've done that have worked well for you. So go ahead and just take a second and write in the chat one or two strategies you've used to build relationships with families in the past. Active listening and validation. Thank you, Randy. That's a really good one. Calling home to get background information on the student and see where the parent feels the student needs are. Another excellent strategy that really makes the families feel empowered to be a part of their children's learning and development. Empathizing, frequent check-ins, movie nights with families who don't have access to movies to build community. Oh, that's a fantastic one, PJ. Parent nights for Spanish speaking families, hosted ESL classes at school, also community outreach in different communities. Um, it's another really important thing is that you can't always expect families to come to where you are. Sometimes it's better to go out in the community and do this work with families to build relationships with them there. There's a really, really fantastic program out of Sacramento called the Parent Teacher Home Visitation Project. If you guys haven't heard of it, I encourage you to look at some of the work that they've done. They've got some really good research, and their whole program is about teachers going to the family home and building relationships with families that it's all very powerful and very positive. Inviting families to sit in on one conversations, excellent. These are all really, really good, and I'm so glad that you guys were able to share with each other. You might want to save this chat before you get off because there's some fantastic ideas in here. So we will carry on. And now we're going to look at incorporating family engagement as an essential instructional strategy. And that is a really, really important thing to do. We know that when homeschool partnerships are used as an instructional strategy, that schools have a tremendous impact. They tend to do much, much better. I try to encourage everyone that I work with to think of family engagement not as a goal. We're not here to engage families. That's not why we do the work that we do. We're here to ensure that every child has every opportunity for success. And that doesn't happen unless we view this as an instructional strategy. Family engagement is an instructional strategy that can get us to those children's success. But we really have to think about how we do that. So one of the challenges we've had in this work in the past is that many people have never had any formal training on how to develop these homeschool partnerships or what to do with them. Often teachers have had no formal training before they get into a classroom about how to engage families. And they go to school because they want to teach children. They're really excited to do it. And then when they get in the classroom, somebody, usually a principal, will come in and say, oh, by the way, you also have to engage all of your families. And how do teachers know how to do it? They often turn to the teacher next door and they say, Bob, how do you engage all these families? And Bob has been teaching for 76 years and he's tired and he's worn out. And what Bob is doing, he learned how to do from the teachers who were there when he got there. And they keep doing the same things over and over, but they're not really having a tremendous impact. And one of the reasons for that is, again, the lack of formal training. So there's a lot of research now that's out that shows there are some family engagement events that are higher impact than others. And unfortunately, most of the events that we've done in the past have fallen into that lower impact category. Things like fundraisers and potlucks, and I'm a big fan of the PTAs, having worked there, but I know that PTA meetings often are lower impact activities. The things we see that are higher impact activities are things like goal setting talks or weekly data sharing folders or regular personalized communication between the schools and the families, positive home calls home. All of these things can have an impact on student outcomes. And those lower impact things, well, typically they don't have an impact. They could if we did them a little differently. If we approached those things as opportunities to really build the capacity of our families rather than just thinking of those as the family engagement events that we have to do because we have to have a family engagement event. We call those random acts of family engagement. If we use those by constructing them in ways that help families understand their children's learning and development, what their children need to know and be able to do by the end of the year, and the progress that they're making to get there, and how families can support them in that progress. Then we could turn some of those lower impact activities into more higher impact activities. But if you do them the way that we always have, they just don't have that effect. Um, what we know from Kathy Hoover Dempsey's research is families need that sense of self efficacy to be able to support what their kids are doing at home. And so every time you bring them in the building, you have an opportunity to develop that sense of self efficacy. And that starts with really sharing with them what their kids need to know and be able to do, and the progress they're making to get there, and what families can do to help. So if you have a school and you have a particular learning goal that your students are struggling with, that's when you need to think about having that family engagement event or activity and bringing families in and then modeling for them the activity you want them to do at home, giving them an opportunity to practice it and giving them feedback on how they're doing. That builds that sense of self-efficacy, and then they're more likely to do those things at home. I have a colleague who loves to tell this story about how when his oldest son started kindergarten, he went to the kindergarten teacher and he said, "What can I do to ensure that Ben is going to be successful? Just tell me what to do. I'll do anything." And the teacher said, "Oh, that's easy. Just read with him every night. If you do that, he'll be fine." And my colleague said, "Well, I mean, you say that, but I'm not real sure what you mean. Do we sit together? Do we sit apart? Is he allowed to interrupt me? How does it work exactly?" And she got a book and she held it up and she said, "Well, here's how you do it. When you start, first do a picture walk through the book. Look at the pictures, talk about what the story might be telling. And then as you're reading, move your finger along the page so that he sees the way that text flows. And every once in a while, stop and ask him a question. Ask him what he thinks is going to happen next. If you do that, that's a predictive question. It's really good to get him to think about those things." And Ron said, "Wow, this is great. Is this what you tell all the families?" And she said, "No one's ever asked me before. I just tell my families, read with your kids." And so the problem is when we look at the research from Kathy Hoover Dempsey, we know that if families don't feel confident to do that, they won't. And so if all we're doing is telling them what we want them to do, we're not giving them that opportunity to build that sense of self-confidence. So we really need to rethink the way that we talk with families about how to support what their kids are doing in school. And it's very different at the secondary level than it is at the elementary level. Because at the secondary level, you may not want families helping with their children's homework and things like that. You certainly wouldn't have wanted me helping my children with their math or science, because I'm old enough that I wasn't required to take science in school. So at the secondary level, the parent's role shifts a bit, and it's not so much about helping with the homework, but it's more about making sure their kids are taking appropriate classes to leave school with a diploma option that's going to let them pursue their dreams, whatever their dreams are. And making sure that they are turning in their assignments and advocating for them if they need extra help or support. So all of those things could happen in any one of these activities if we structure them the right way. So as you're thinking about how to integrate family engagement into the work that you do, and I'm not sure how many of you are classroom teachers or if you work in other roles in your school, but one thing you can do tomorrow that would be a really powerful way to engage families in what their kids are doing in school is to share with them what they're learning and share them 2 or 3 questions that they could ask during the week. Because the one question that every family knows is, "What did you learn today?" And the one response that most families get is nothing. And that's usually a conversation killer. When kids come home and families say, "What did you learn today?" and kids say nothing, families have no idea where to go after that because they have no idea what kids are learning. So if you have in your class or in the teachers' classes in your schools or buildings, if you have all of the staff communicate to families every Monday, hey, when your kids come home this week, we are studying dinosaurs. Ask your kids what a triceratops eats. And again, I don't know dinosaurs. I wasn't required to take science, so I'm not sure that's a real animal, but questions like that will have kids reflect back on things that happened in the classroom that will be specific to what they're learning. And that's a really good way to reinforce the things that are happening in the classroom. Also, teachers should decide what are the skills that the kids in my class are really struggling with the most. And then if you could wave a magic wand, what would you want families to do at home to help them with that? Those are the things you should be communicating with families about. Families often say they get all kinds of messages from school. We do a ton of family engagement assessments through my work with Scholastic, and we survey families as a part of that. And they feel like schools are great communicators, but the problem is they're not always communicating to them actionable steps that are clearly aligned with their own child's progress. And families don't know that because they don't know what they don't know, and so they think everything is great. You should also think about, particularly at the secondary level, how can families support, monitor, and advocate on behalf of their student? At the secondary level, there's a lot of unique challenges because suddenly families go from having one teacher that they can talk to all the time to having many teachers, and they aren't always sure who to communicate with. One thing you could do to alleviate some of that confusion is to structure your communication channels so that each family is assigned to a particular teacher, whether you use a homeroom model or a case management model, but teachers can be the primary contact point for a group of families, and then they can communicate with other teachers and get back to families or even initiate meetings between all of the teachers together. I was doing some work in Oregon a couple of weeks ago, and I was working with a high school there that had this really great program set up where they call them nests. And they have all of the kids in a particular nest, and the teacher who's assigned to the nest stays with the same nest all the years the kids are in school. So they have that primary contact point for 4 years, hopefully. And families have the opportunity to build a relationship with that child's nest teacher. It's just a really, really good model. And then you should also think about how you can use all of your communication channels to reach out to your families. Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet that works when you're trying to communicate to all of the families that you have in the children's classes. Some families prefer email, some prefer text, some prefer phone calls. And so thinking about how you can share this information with them about what they can do to support their children means you sometimes have to do it in multiple channels if you're going to reach all of your families. So I'm going to ask you now to put in the chat, what are some of the strategies that you've used to share information with families in the past, and how have you connected them to what their children were learning or their children's development? I'll give everybody a minute to chime in. Have you guys had the opportunity to connect with families? The question is, how have you connected with families? What are the strategies you've used to connect with them? Or what are some of the ways you've shared with them what their children are learning and how they can support that? Have there been particular messages that have worked for you that maybe would work with some of your peers or colleagues on the webinar? I hope that clarified it, Latasha. There's a really great video of Teacher of the Year from Florida in 2017, which was actually pre-pandemic. And one of the strategies she uses is she takes home chart paper, sticks it on the wall, and then turns on Facebook Live in the evenings, a couple nights a week, and does like little mini lessons. So families who are on Facebook can like tune in and watch what she does. that's a really good example of a strategy that works with a lot of families. Um, Jamie says phone calls, texts, home visits, letters sent home, information on the website, texts and phone calls have worked best. That's awesome. Thank you. Amanda said, I find it helpful to reach out to each individual family and gain some insight to how they prefer to communicate and get their information. Some prefer social media and some don't have the internet and prefer a newsletter. Yeah, Amanda, that's so true. Some families have greater access to technology than others, and it's really great that you're doing both. Jacobia, I hope I said that right. She said weekly parent communication from teachers, weekly parent newsletters from the principal, monthly newsletters, virtual parent meetings, phone calls, home visits. Excellent stuff. Liz Marie, I hope I said that right. Calling and texting both work for my families. They're open to feedback and strategies to use at home that work in our building. Some students have star charts where they earn rewards and we send pictures home or pictures of their work with the student holding it. Pictures are so powerful. I'm so happy to hear that you're using that strategy. There's another great video on the YouTube page for the Flamboyant Foundation where they interview a parent who talks about her relationship with her child's teacher. Her name is Miss Kaya. And Miss Kaya says she didn't have a great relationship with her child's teacher until one day the school did home visits. And then the teacher started following up with pictures of her daughter working in her classroom. And she said the pictures just changed everything for her. And then when the school had to call her to tell her there was a problem in the classroom, Miss Kaya said, this is the first time I didn't get defensive. And I really thought about, they want what's best for my child, and so do I, and we have to work together. So she says she tells them to put the child on the phone and tells the child, if your teacher tells you something, it's just like I'm telling you something. And they didn't have any more problems. It's a really powerful video. Madeline, I see that you asked where you can find it. If I will put it in the chat box when we get to a breaking point. But if you Google Flamboyant and APTT and Stanton Elementary, all of the videos should pop up. They're really, really powerful. Anna says regular telephone calls via cell with parents. Parents are invited to call me whenever they have questions or concerns. I love that, Anna. That's fantastic. Latasha says, I've personally used the children to see what is the best way to communicate with their parents. And starting there, parents really love communication from teachers. They really, really do. Jamie says, as a parent, I love when the teacher or principal send pictures of what they're doing in class or post pictures on Twitter of special programs they're doing in school. Jamie, that is such a fantastic point. I've worked with so many educators that they really expect these things when it comes to their own children. And so it would make sense to do those for other people's children as well. And if we think about it that way, it's much easier to think about how we can work with families and kids in our classroom. You're just doing what you would want any other teacher to do for you. All right, this is good stuff. Let's move on to the final section. We're going to talk about strengthening educator and family capacity to partner around student learning. So building professional capacity for educators is a really important strategy and something that has not always been something we spent a lot of time on. When families are going to be asked to support what their kids are learning, we need to think of those families as adult learners. And so approach that with adult learning strategies and best practices as we think about how to coach them to support what their children are learning. Also incorporating homeschool partnership strategies during PLC meetings. That's a great opportunity to talk with your peers about how they're engaging with families and start to think about how can we do this in a way that's going to be supporting all of the work the students are doing. Showcasing and highlighting exemplars of model practice among staff is a really great way to sort of create a ripple effect. And when we see things that are going well, we can emulate that and start to implement those practices in classrooms throughout the building. It's kind of frustrating for families if they're in a school and they get a teacher who's doing all of these really good practice things, and then the next year they get a teacher who doesn't know about them, and they're not sending home half the communication the first teacher did. Families get frustrated. And so thinking about family engagement in your building in more of a systemic way is a great way to approach this. And take advantage of free webinars and courses on elevating family engagement practices. The NEA has some micro credentials now around family engagement that are free for NEA members, and they're really, really, really good. NAFSCI, my organization, is doing a lot of work on pre-service, and right now I'm actually building an online virtual academy on how we communicate about family engagement that will be available probably sometime this fall. NAFSCI also offers a lot of webinars on the topic, so if you get a chance, check out our website on that. And coaching teachers on quality interactions rather than just ensuring compliance is really important too. All of these things are really good strategies. Here's a few more. Positive phone calls home at the beginning of the year before kids have any problems goes a long way towards having successful communication with them when problems do arise. And making sure that anytime you bring families into the building or have any type of virtual meetings with them, you're connecting it to what kids are learning and what families could do to support that. Teachers should decide what they want families to do at home, and then that should be what they focus on as they're communicating with families. Also sharing those questions that I mentioned about what children are learning and what families can ask that are specific to the things that are happening in the classroom is a really powerful strategy you could implement tomorrow. Also, if you create vignettes and videos and tip sheets, you could build almost like a little resource library of those things. So you won't have to create them over and over year after year. But when you see a child struggling with a skill and you've already created a tip sheet or a video about that skill, you can shoot that home to the family every year. And most importantly is using data like a flashlight. One of the challenges that we've had in doing this work is that families often have no idea how well their children are doing in school. There was a study from Learning Heroes a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic. They asked families all over the country, do you think your child is learning or is performing at or above grade level? And 90% of all families said yes. When we actually look at national testing data, it's only 40%, and it's 20% for some subgroups when you disaggregate that data. So that's a huge problem for us, because remember what I said about Kathy Hoover Dempsey's research. She said families need to feel that what they're going to do is going to help their child. But if they feel like their child is doing just fine and they work multiple low-wage jobs, and taking time off of those jobs to go to a school event means they're going to be making a smaller paycheck this week, it's not really a priority for them. We have to do a better job of helping families understand exactly what their children need to know and be able to do, and the progress that they're making to get there. And unfortunately, often families just assume that if their child is making passing grades, they're performing at grade level and mastering the standards. And those are not always the same things. One of the schools I've worked with for a couple of years is in Leavenworth, Kansas, and they do a great job of sharing data with their families. They have these data walls, and there's one for reading and literacy, and there's one for math. And on their data walls, each grade level is color coded, so families can see the grade level, all the kids in the grade level. Each card, there's a big wall, and there's cards under each reading and math, and each card has a number on it, and the number correlates with the student number that the families know. So they can look at those cards and they can see where their child is compared to their peers. The walls are structured so that they have the kids who are not on grade level on one side, then they have a line. They call it Lunsford's line because Mr. Lunsford is the principal. And on the other side is proficiency. And they communicate to the families at the beginning of the school year, our mission is to get every child across Lunsford's line. And you guys can help us do that. It's a really important message and a really powerful way to share data with families. So we already have some structures that exist that can maximize those family engagement best practices. There's lesson planning. As teachers are doing their lesson planning, they can be thinking about how they're going to communicate this information to families. There are often PLC meetings, and those are opportunities to carve out some time maybe to make phone calls home or to share strategies with each other. There are opportunities that teachers have for instructional coaching, so people can be helping them as they're thinking about how they're going to communicate and what they're going to communicate to families. We have written and verbal communications. There's a lot of newsletters and emails and websites that go out to families all the time, and we can leverage those to include information that they need to help support what their children are learning. Homework it's another great opportunity to really help families by helping them understand what's happening in the classroom. So thinking about how we can engage families through that homework process is really important. And then existing events. A lot of schools I work with have existing events that have become sort of a cultural component of the school building. Everybody in the school community looks forward to them, and they may not have any links to learning right now, but thinking about how we can use those things that people in the school community already love, that already exist, and then tapping into that to add that learning component is really powerful. So let's turn back to the chat. If you guys would just put in there, what are some of the existing structures that you use to engage families in their children's learning and development? Any existing structures that you use to maximize family engagement? I know when we do our family engagement assessments through Scholastic, we also survey teachers. And one of the #1 challenges that teachers say they face is lack of time. They're always concerned that these ideas are going to take too much time, and they're already pretty busy as it is. So I love using the PLC, like carving a little time out of that, just not even like every time, but once in a while, to do some of this family engagement work is really powerful. Also, it's important for teachers to understand that some of these suggestions may take a little time, but they actually save time in the long run. And what I mean by that is family engagement has a really big return on investment, because when families are engaged, kids have better behavior and social skills, and they have fewer absences and tardies, which means teachers spend less time trying to contact home because kids aren't in the classroom, or they spend less time disciplining kids and sending kids out, which gives them more time to focus on the teaching and learning. Okay. So we are about at the Q&A portion, but I want to make sure before we get there that all of you have my contact information. The easiest way to reach me is by email, because I'm usually out buzzing around in the most beautiful car in the world. So you can reach me at wilsons@nafsky.org. I would love to hear more from you about the work that you're doing, and support you in any way I can. Truthfully, I feel like family engagement is something I'm very passionate about. And so if you're struggling, or if you need someone to bounce ideas off of, you can feel free to reach out to me at any point. I'm happy to talk about it anytime. And I see we got a comment from Judy. She polls parents at the beginning of the year as to what their child's strengths, interests, and challenges are, and the best ways to interact and problem solve with their child. That's awesome, Judy. Another thing you can do at the beginning of the year that's similar to what Judy's doing is asking families what are their hopes and dreams for their children. One of the schools I worked with in Kansas started doing that at their back to school night, and they actually gave parents, they had like an oak leaf that they cut out, and every family that came in got one, and they would write their hopes and dreams for their child on the oak leaf. And then at the end of the night, they collected them all and they made a giant tree with these leaves at the beginning, at the front of the school building. So everybody that walked in, that was the first thing they saw when they got to the building. And it was a constant reminder of why we do the work that we do, and a constant reminder to families that we're all in this to ensure that every kid has every opportunity for success. It was really powerful. Excellent idea, Judy. Okay. I think we'll open it up for questions now.
Thank you, Sherry. That was wonderful and a wealth of information that I think will be really valuable to our attendees. So one question that came up is, what strategies would you suggest when there is a pervasive mistrust of schools from communities due to disparity issues? So for instance, in some of the urban communities, they don't always trust the schools. So can you speak to that and give some strategies?
Yeah, I sure can. I think a really important thing to think about is not always bringing families into the school building. Sometimes you have to go where the families are as you start to build that trust with them. So if there are trusted community members that are out in the community, partnering with them and then having events or activities or meetings in their facilities is a great way to start to encourage families to start to rebuild that trust and build some relationships. We know from the research that families need to have connections to people in the building, whether it is the principal or the teachers or even other families. And the more connections they have, the more they're going to be supportive of the school and what's happening in the school. So having opportunities where you are going to them and working in their community and partnering with people who are already trusted helps to extend that trust a little bit, and then you can build from there. One more thing about that, I would also point you out to, there's a book called Beyond the Bake Sale. I don't know if anybody's heard it. I actually have it right here because it is one of my favorite books in the whole world. It is by Dr. Karen Mapp and Ann Henderson, and it has a lot of strategies that are similar to that about connecting with families outside of the school building. And in particular, there are 4 core beliefs you really have to hold to do this work effectively. And so they spend a lot of time talking about what those core beliefs are. And sometimes, in addition to addressing the trust issues out in the community, sometimes there's also issues of bias amongst staff. Often they're working with families that are very different from themselves, and they may not have a lot of experience with that community. In the Beyond the Bake Sale book, there are 4 core beliefs that you have to hold to do this work well, and they really do a good job of exploring those. One of those core beliefs is that all families have dreams for their children and want the best for them. And if you don't believe that because you think there are some families that just don't care, that's a problem. And you have to also examine that and address that as you're trying to build those relationships with families.
Sherry, would it be too much trouble to ask you what the other 3 core beliefs are?
No, not at all. I love talking about them. So core belief number 1 is all families have dreams for their children and want the best for them. Number 2 is all families have the capacity to support their children's learning. Number 3 is families and school staff should be equal partners. And number 4 is the responsibility for building and sustaining homeschool partnerships rests primarily on the school, especially school leaders. And all 4 of those are backed by research.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I just thought while you were started, we would have you continue.
Yeah.
So another question is sometimes staff in schools are mandated reporters and they have to make a report when there is an issue of abuse or neglect. And then how do they re-engage those parents so that that trust is rebuilt and not damaged so much when that report has to get made?
Yeah, that is a really tough situation because everybody wants kids to be safe. So, a couple of things I would say about that is first of all, making sure that families understand all you care about is the health and safety of your students is first priority. And everybody needs to be clear that what you do is to protect kids. And sometimes you have to do things that are painful for everyone, but it's an opportunity for families and kids to get back on the right track. The other thing I would say about that is as you think about family engagement, remember family engagement is not biological parent engagement. And there could be another adult caregiver in that child's life that you could work with to ensure that the kids are still getting information and support that they need for their families to help them be successful in school.
Thank you, Sherry. And one last question. Can you speak at all to how to engage families that are displaced, such as families who are displaced because of a disaster or families who are displaced because of an immigration concern? Can you speak to those engagements for those families particularly?
Yeah, that's also a big challenge, especially right now. We have a lot of families that are really suffering. If it's not the hurricane, it's the fires out west. And I mean, there's a lot of natural disasters that are happening around us. And we have new immigrant families who are coming in all the time who also struggle with institutions because they may or may not be comfortable working with institutions because of fear of deportation or whatever. And those are all legitimate fears. I think the more you can partner with people who are also working with those families, the better off you'll be. That's sort of extending your own reach. And often they have built trusting, respectful relationships with families that you can tag along with. So communicating with other providers in your community and finding out, where those families are is a really important first step. And also asking families when you do connect with them what they need and then helping them access those resources. If you have social workers in your school, connecting them to the families and making sure your social workers are very aware of all of the resources in the community so they can help connect families to other resources is really important. Also, I think making sure, especially for immigrant families, making sure that you're respectful of their language needs and that you have interpreters or translators whenever possible and not relying on their children to do it. That is usually doesn't work out as well as we would like, and it's kind of unfair to put the kids in that position. So making sure you have people who are trained translators and interpreters that can help you communicate with families. And as always, making sure the front of your building looks like a warm, welcoming place that people would want to visit and not like a prison, as I've been to some of those schools and nobody wants to go there.
So I think that concludes our questions and answers. Sherry, if you could just put the next slide up.
Sure.
So again, the MHTTC is funded through SAMHSA to provide this training. So as part of receiving that funding, we are required to submit data related to the quality of the spend. So at the end of today's training, please take a moment to complete the brief survey about today's training. You can scan the QR code, or you can also click on the link to the evaluation in the chat box. So we're just gonna leave that up for a minute. We'd also like your feedback in guiding our educational training and technical assistant efforts. We do have a needs assessment. I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, Sherry. And again, you can scan the QR code on your screen to access that assessment. And And the direct link will also be shared in the chat box. So those are two things that we just ask you to complete. Again, the evaluation is tied to our funding, and the needs assessment allows us to understand what your needs are so that we can meet those in the future. Next slide, Sherry. And again, we understand some of the information that can be presented may be sensitive in nature. So we encourage everyone to take care of themselves and each other. And so we provide on the screen some links to resources that you might find useful. You will also find them on the conference webpage. Next slide, Sherry. So we do encourage you to join us for our next session, which is new resources, classroom-wise, and self-regulation and positive outcomes with emotional regulation, the POWER program. So these are two brand new programs that we're going to be introducing to you. Really good information that will happen at 10:30 to 11:45. So again, next slide, Sherry. If you want to connect with us, we are on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You have our website there and our email. So if you have a special request or you want additional information, please feel free to reach out and connect with us. We would like to thank our presenter, Sherry Wilson, for joining us today, and we appreciate your participation and look forward to you joining us at our next session. So thank you very much, Sherry. And again, Sherry has given her information, so please reach out to her. She is a wealth of information and always willing to help out schools with family engagement. So thank you, Sherry, very much for joining us.
PJ, there's a request to go back to the QR codes.
Absolutely. Sherry, can you go back to the, okay, so that's the evaluation code. So we'll leave that one up for a few minutes. Thank you for that request. And then after a few minutes, we'll go to our needs assessment. And there is our needs assessment QR code. And again, both of those links are in the chat box for your responses. So again, we'd like to thank everybody for coming today, and please join us in our remaining sessions for the rest of the day. Those are all available on our website if you want to check out which sessions are up and coming for the rest of the day. And we certainly would like you to join us in those sessions.